Nigeria's food inflation rate dropped sharply to 16.87% in September 2025 from 21.87% in August, driven by low prices of maize and grains. Now, data from the National Bureau of Statistics shows that food inflation contracted by 1.57% month on month as harvests across major agricultural regions boosted supply and eased pressure on prices. Overall, headline inflation also fell to 18.02%, down from 20.12% in August. However, the decline was uneven across states, with Ekiti recording 28.68%, Rivers 24.18%, and Nasarawa 22.74%. That is part of the major producing states in Nigeria, actually recording the highest year-on-year food inflation rates. So to help make sense of these particular statistics by the NBS, I'm joined by Samuel Oyekanmi, lead research and insight at Norrenberger. Samuel, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure joining you. Good morning.
All right, so for you, what led to the drop in Nigeria's food inflation rate, 21.87% to 16.87%? In September? Of course, the NBS talked about grains and some staple foods, but then how true are these figures and how realistically evidential are these stats in the Nigerian markets?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, right? A number of things would contribute to the decline in inflation, and pretty much in line with a lot of expectations in the economy and across various economists. So things around base effect from last year, we've been dealing with very high inflationary numbers before now, and so they expectedly, right, what you have now going forward is that there's been some level of slowdown as a result of those base effects. We've also seen a couple of things around policy stability in terms of things like FX and a host of many other things. But when you bring it home to food, right, I think majorly this is as a result of seasonality, right? We are in the harvest season for a number of those staple food items. And what I've also seen in recent time has been that there's been a significant drop in some of those food items. And to speak to how realistic it is, right, I'll be quoting Nairametrics food price survey that they did in September, and things like the big bag of pepper saw like a 25% decline in terms of price in the month of September. Things around fish also 12.5% decline. Things around local 50 kg bag of rice also saw almost 10% reduction in terms of price also compared to the previous month. So we had quite some of those notable reduction in food prices for many of those things that are seasonal in nature. And I'd say to a large extent, yes, the decline was expected. Of course, no one saw it to the extent of 16%, but it only speaks to the level of how much supply we saw. And because even again, the month-on-month deflation also gave you an indication of how steep that decline was compared to the previous month.
Okay, so let's leave Nairametrics alone. Let's look at reality, more or less like how it affects you as a person. I don't know if you've been to the market lately. You mentioned a couple of some consumables, pepper, fish, and some other, consumables as regards the drop in price, whether marginal, or actually effectual. But then, would you say that these are the true realities in terms of the price difference? Because we've seen the price of gas increase, we've seen the price of petrol relatively increase, fluctuating between 1,800 naira. Of course, we can talk about the harvest season because the rain has been, quite abundant for a couple of weeks now. But then people still go to the market and discover that they pay a certain price, but then the quantity drops if the price does not actually improve. So I'm still trying to find out, in terms of your own experience, aside quotable statistics, is it truly reflective that prices of these consumables are actually dropping?
So it is debatable how much of a decline it has been, but I can tell you for a fact when it comes to food prices, right, it has dropped. I stay in Abuja, and I'll tell you that 2 months ago, what I used to buy things around pepper, tomatoes, onions has at least dropped more than half in the last 2 months. And that I can tell you for a fact based on what I consume, right? And there've also been some other things around things like melon, and a couple of other consumables that are quite seasonal in nature. I'd say yes, prices have declined to a large extent, at least speaking from my own locality here in Abuja. And the reason I was also quoting Norrenberger was that survey, they do it in Lagos, right, across 4 markets. So to a large extent, I also expect that to be as realistic as possible. So why we might want to speak about things around energy and gas specifically, I think that increase happened early in October, or at the very least post the survey that the NBS will carry out for their consumer price index report. So I would not expect the surge in the price of gas to reflect in the month of September. But of course, I would expect that by next month, when we are looking towards the numbers for October, that component should of course reflect there, at least from the energy side of that component. But don't forget, food again still accounts for almost 50% of that inflation basket. So the chances are it could still slow down if we continue to see this disinflationary trend in terms of food prices. But I can tell you, to a large extent, agricultural produce has reduced. Speaking, quoting Narrametrics survey, and then based on what I experienced here in Abuja.
Okay, well, I'll go to the markets probably today or tomorrow just to verify from my own end. But then, as we approach the festive season, can this downward trend, as you said, in food inflation be sustained beyond the harvest period, or should Nigerians expect probably a possible rebound later in the year?
Okay, so historically, right, what we found is that except for the years like 2016 and 2020, 2016 was global economic meltdown, 2020 was COVID year. So except for those 2 years, we'll find that in the period of July, August, September, food prices would moderate even at some point into October. But then you find towards the tail end of the year, around November, December, you start seeing prices also tick up a little bit. So of course, I would expect that as a result of the whole buying rally that you'd always find towards the tail end of the year, we might not be able to sustain those numbers at those current levels. But are they going to be as alarming as we used to find them in recent time? I don't expect that to be the case, because what we've seen is that a number of things have actually shaped the market and the economy. I think the government have also done quite a lot in terms of, one, that there is the FX component on food prices, right? It has been stable and even appreciated in recent times. So you'd expect that at least that part of the equation is moderated significantly. Then you talk about the rise in terms of demand for festivity. Again, that could also drive that. But by the time you look at both ends, we'll see some increase in terms of prices, but maybe not as significant as taking us back to the levels of 26, 27% like we used to have before now. But yes, till end of the year, the expectation is that prices would have some form of tick.
Okay, so earlier on you talked about the base effects. You also mentioned the policies of government that has to do with FX stability. Though we've seen a little bit of depreciation in the last 24 hours. But then when you look at these government policies and their interventions, are they sustainable, or there's a need for some sort of moderation if we are hoping to still drive down inflationary pressures?
I think there's quite a lot to be done. At no point in time should anybody look at the government and say what they have done is enough. I don't think that makes sense in any environment. Yes, the government has quite come up with a number of initiatives, but many of those things are long term. If you look at them, right, many of them run through to the year 2027, some of them even beyond 2030. And so it looks good from a long-term perspective, but short-term also we need to start looking at those issues that affect, again, let's maybe just restrict to food prices now, things around structural issues, transportation, logistics, the value chain across the agricultural chain as a whole. We start looking at each of those areas where price increases tends to come about. Things around insecurity also. I remember you mentioned while giving your summary, a state like Nasarawa, which is supposed to be one of those largely highly producing states in Nigeria in terms of food, also experiencing significant high inflationary numbers, and that speaks to the level of insecurity that you find. 2 weeks ago, last week, we're at a conference hosted by the World Bank, where the governor of Nasarawa mentioned a number of policies, a number of initiatives that have been put in place to drive food prices downwards. But again, there's always that gray area of insecurity. And beyond Nasarawa, many other regions also in the country, especially food producing regions, also suffer same fate. So there's a need for the government from the federal side and also from the state, and even local constituencies and local governments needs to put their hands together to be able to start tackling some of this issues that impact prices. And I think if we can do that, then we can sustain what we've been able to achieve so far. And I think beyond these also, we need a lot more private players in there. We need to start thinking away from small holding farming into more large scale, adopting technology, for example, even in the agricultural system. By the time you have a lot more of these capitals moving to, we start seeing production in large capacity, which is able to drive food sustainability locally, and then even have enough and a lot more to be able to export.
All right. Okay. So let's look at how, even before we get to the point where we are able to drive large-scale food production in the country, let's look at the current situation as how it affects household spending, consumer confidence. We know that for a couple of months now, if not years, Nigerians have had to borrow in order to augment their spendings. Some people have had to cut, costs and cut spendings just to be able to have enough to go by for the month, most especially those who are salary earners. But then when you look at what the mood or the sentiment might be like now that we're seeing that figures are dropping, what do you see happening? How is it impacting their expenses and the overall economic growth?
Yeah, so for one, when average citizens, right, see their prices are dropping, it of course boosts the level of confidence that Nigerians have in the economy. And beyond that, it also improves the level of social trust to an extent. And then, and all this is a function of the fact that their real income has been able to improve. And I think that's good. Because of course, just like you mentioned before now, a number of Nigerians have actually had to do a lot of biting in order to be able to meet ends meet, right? Specifically food. In fact, those very common things that an average person requires to be able to be alive, things around food, clothing and accommodation has really been a major bane for many Nigerians. And the fact that at least more than 40% of that component, which is food, has started seeing some level of reduction in price, that should, to a large extent, improve the sentiment around Nigerians. And what that does, again, is that it helps them to have a lot more to be able to save. Our saving and investment culture in Nigeria is not so high. And that's really understandable, because when you live from hand to mouth every now and then, many Nigerians, you find them that they take salary advances before the end of the month, because by mid of the month, salary is done. But again, if we are able to find ourselves in situations like this and it's sustainable to the point that food prices begin to slow considerably, generally inflation finds itself at single digits and in real terms, where Nigerians actually trust those numbers. Because there's also another part of the fact that Nigerians don't trust these numbers when they come out. So again, if we start seeing those numbers really reflect and we trust the numbers, right, to the point that we find them around single digit, I think most Nigerians will find that very, very welcomed, and then we'll be able to start seeing more capital being deployed towards productivity, and that could also help advance the Nigerian economy. And again, we are trying to hit $1 trillion economy in 2030. It is not just going to be done by the government. It involves government, private sector, and private sector also incorporates even large individuals who will be able to have a lot more capitals to be able to drive economic activities.
Well, I tell you that Nigerians in Ekiti, Rivers, and Nasarawa states will definitely not be trusting that particular data coming from the NBS. I mean, in Ekiti State, we are talking 28.68% in terms of food inflation. Rivers 24.18%, Nasarawa 22.74%, as against what the NBS is saying, which of course represents a national statistics at 16.87% as regards food inflation. But then when you look at these key states, all right, in terms of the output, and the fact that they have to still pay more, to purchase these foodstuff. What explains what we call regional disparities, most especially as it affects these states compared to other states?
Yeah, I think it's a no-brainer, right? States like Rivers, Ekiti, they're not typically food producing regions when you compare them with some other states in Nigeria, the likes of Benue and some other northern states, where a number of these vegetables and staple food items are being harvested. So the chances are, because they are not producing, they have to spend a whole lot more in terms of transportation. So there's issues around transportation, logistics, warehousing. How able are these states able to harness some of these harvested commodities from the other regions in the country and then warehouse them to meet those supply and those demands? I mean, it's always a question. It's always a question mark for many of the states that don't produce food as much. So I think that's one of the main reasons. For a state like Nasarawa, I don't think it's a function of production. I don't think it's a function of inability to produce, but then they also have insecurity concerns, right, around those regions. So when you're living in an environment where you're not safe to go to your farm, I don't see how well you want to be able to visit your farm and do actual farming business. So that becomes an issue. So by the time you look at each of these states, they have their own peculiarities and have their own different, unique issues, which you tend to see affect prices at the end of the day. So for Rivers and Ekiti, I'd say logistics issues, they're not typically producing states. Transportation, warehousing, and a host of that. Nasarawa, for me, I would say mostly insecurity.
Okay. All right. Even as we wrap up on this, Samuel, for investors who operate within Nigeria's business ecosystem, those in the agribusiness, and of course the central bank when it comes to its monetary policy decisions, how would that affect them? How does it affect? How would it affect them in the long term? And what should we expect when it comes to these policy decisions? Just in about,
Okay, so,
1 minute, 30 seconds, please.
Okay, so I'll start with businesses, of course. Businesses operating in food chain, agricultural chain, understand now that seasonality plays a significant impact, a significant role in terms of price at the end of the day. Usually, we don't tend to see that so much, but what we've seen in the month of September is that this seasonality really has so much impact on prices, and I think they will want to capitalize on that. What you'll find is that if you have so much supply now, a number of these farmers would want to warehouse some of these things up until the time where we move away from the harvest season, and then they'll be able to even make a lot more profit from that. Okay. And away from that, the CBN last month had cut the interest rate by 50 basis points, right? And the expectation is that with this much slowdown in inflation, the chances are we're going to get another rate cut in the month of November. And maybe that's what we really need so that Nigerians can access lower credits in terms of interest rates.
Yeah, of course. We hope that will happen. Of course. Thank you so much, Samuel Oyekanmi, lead research and insights at Norrenberger. It was nice talking to you at this time.